Just cancel it, Evan said, already halfway out of his chair. He twirled the car keys around his finger like the answer was obvious. I need the car. I stayed seated. I can't, I said calmly. I have a doctor's appointment. I've been waiting weeks. Evan laughed under his breath. You can reschedule. This is important. I'm not cancelling, I said. My voice didn't shake. I said no. The room shifted. Not loudly, just enough. My mother looked up from the stove. Rachel, she said sharply, warning already built into my name. Don't do this. I'm not doing anything, I replied. I already explained. I barely had time to register the movement. My mother crossed the kitchen fast. Her palm connected with my face in a sound so sharp it cut through the room. A crack. Clean. Loud. My head snapped sideways. For a second, I couldn't tell if I was standing or falling. The world tilted, like someone had lifted one edge of it. My ears rang. I tasted blood. Then came the silence. My mother stood in front of me, chest rising and falling. You don't refuse your brother, she said. Not in this house. I pressed my hand to my cheek, waiting for the dizziness to settle. Evan didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just watched, expression neutral, as if this was a predictable outcome. From behind me, my father finally spoke. You should have just done what he asked, Thomas said quietly. You know how your mother is. That was the line. The one I'd heard my whole life. Not are you okay? Not that went too far. Just a reminder that peace in this family depended on my obedience. I nodded once. Not because I agreed, but because I knew better than to argue in that moment. Evan needed something. I resisted. This was the result. As I rinsed my mouth at the sink, it hit me with uncomfortable clarity. This wasn't discipline. It wasn't anger. It was punishment. For saying no. For forgetting that Evan's needs always came first. Behind me, Evan muttered, You make everything difficult. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. My cheek throbbed, but the deeper pain settled somewhere quieter, heavier. As I stepped outside, cold air biting my skin, I knew this moment would cost me more than bruises, and none of them understood that yet. By the next morning, my face looked normal enough to pass. A faint shadow under my cheekbone, easy to explain away if anyone asked. No one did. My mother moved through the house like nothing had happened. Evan slept late. Life continued in the same quiet, uneven way it always had. That was the part that hurt more than the slap, how ordinary it all felt. Growing up, Evan was never wrong. Not officially. If he broke something, it was because I distracted him. If he failed a class, it was because I hadn't helped him enough. If he lost his temper, it was because I provoked him by existing too loudly, too slowly, too independently. I learned early how the rules worked. Evan acted. I adjusted. When we were kids, my mother would sigh and say, "He's sensitive," whenever he lashed out. When I cried, she called it drama. When Evan needed money, it appeared. When I needed shoes for work, I was told to wait until next month. He got a used car at 18. I got a lecture about responsibility. By high school, I was running the house in everything but name. Laundry, dishes, scheduling, emotional cleanup. If my mother was upset, it was my job to absorb it. If Evan was angry, it was my job to smooth it over. Being useful was how I stayed safe. Being invisible was how I survived. Evan learned something too. He learned that consequences bent around him. That apologies were optional. That his needs carried weight simply because they were his. My mother reinforced it without hesitation. "You're the older one," she'd tell me. "Be mature." Which was never a compliment. It was a warning. It meant take less so he can have more. It meant don't need things. It meant don't say no. Money was always part of it. Evan's hobbies were investments. My necessities were expenses. If he needed help, it was family. If I did, it was inconvenient. I picked up extra shifts. I paid my own way. I learned not to ask, because asking never changed the answer, it only added shame. Somewhere along the way, I internalized the math of it. Be useful or be invisible. Carry the weight quietly. Don't expect fairness, expect patterns. Years later, I'd hear people talk about families having a golden child and a problem child. In our house, the roles were quieter but just as fixed. One of us was protected. The other was expected to endure. That night, lying awake with ice pressed to my cheek, a memory surfaced that I hadn't thought about in years. Evan was 15. I was 21. He'd taken my savings envelope from my room, rent money, and spent it. When I confronted him, my mother said I shouldn't have left cash lying around. Evan never apologized. He never replaced it. At the time, I told myself it was carelessness, immaturity, bad luck. Now, with my face still sore and my mother's words echoing in my head, the memory felt different, sharper, deliberate. And for the first time, I wondered if it had always been. That memory stayed with me the next few days, the envelope, the missing money, the way no one had questioned him. It made something click. Not loudly, quietly, like a drawer sliding into place. Evan didn't change after that night. If anything, he grew bolder. My silence had always been his safety net, and now he leaned into it. A week later, he laughed about the slap like it was a joke we were all supposed to be in on. "Guess you won't say no again," he said once, grinning, as if my bruised cheek had been a lesson he'd taught me. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with confidence. The kind that comes from never being corrected. He started making comments whenever my parents were around. About how I was bad with money. About how I owed the family for living there. About how I should be grateful Evan let things go. Each remark landed softly, disguised as humor, but the intent was sharp. He was reminding me of my place. What hurt more was how easily it worked. My father sat through it all, eyes on his phone or the television. When Evan went too far, Thomas would clear his throat and say something like, "You know how your brother is," as if that explained everything. As if Evan's behavior was whether unfortunate, but inevitable. Once, after Evan mocked me in front of a neighbor, I asked my father why he never said anything. He shrugged. "It's easier this way," he said. "You don't need to escalate things." I understood then that I was the escalation. Not Evan's cruelty. Not my mother's violence. My reaction, that was the problem. Evan thrived on that imbalance. He spoke freely because he knew I wouldn't contradict him. He rewrote small stories, who paid for what, who handled which bills, and no one corrected him. Silence made his version feel true. That's when I noticed something else. Small details I'd ignored before. Mail addressed to me, opened and set aside. My name used on shared accounts I didn't fully control. Evan referencing my credit and my paperwork in ways that didn't quite line up. Once, I overheard him on the phone saying, "Yeah, it's under Rachel's name, but it's basically mine." The sentence sat wrong in my body. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I remembered how confrontation had always ended. Instead, I started paying attention. Dates. Amounts. What he touched without asking. What my parents assumed was his right. Evan mistook my calm for weakness, like he always had. He kept talking, kept joking, kept pushing, and I stopped reacting. Not because I was afraid, but because I was finally curious. I carried that curiosity with me into places where my family wasn't present. It changed how I moved through the world. A few days after everything at the house, I went to a long-delayed medical appointment. It wasn't dramatic. Just something I'd been putting off because time, money, and energy always seemed to run out before I did. That morning, I sat alone in a beige waiting room, filling out forms carefully, double-checking insurance numbers I knew by heart because no one else ever handled them for me. When Dr. Alvarez came in, he didn't rush. He asked how I was doing and then actually waited for the answer. When he noticed the faint yellowing along my jaw, his voice shifted, not accusatory, just attentive. "Did you have an injury recently?" he asked. I told him I'd walked into a cabinet door. The lie came easily. Years of practice. He didn't challenge it, but he didn't ignore it either. He asked a few more questions. About sleep, stress, headaches, how long it had been since my last visit. When I admitted I'd delayed care because of work and insurance timing, he nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world. "That happens more than people think," he said. "Especially when someone's used to handling everything themselves." Something about the way he said themselves landed. Outside that house, I wasn't treated like excess. I wasn't spoken over or minimized. I was addressed directly. My answers mattered. My schedule mattered. Even my hesitation mattered. He explained things plainly, how stress can hide in the body, How missed appointments stack up quietly, how people who postpone their own care often don't realize how much responsibility they're carrying until their health pushes back. It wasn't a lecture. It was information, offered without judgment. Before I left, he paused at the door and asked what I did for work. I told him. He glanced at my chart again, then back at me. You know, he said carefully, with your background, you might qualify for a program we partner with. It helps with coverage and scheduling flexibility. A lot of people don't realize they're eligible. I blinked. I don't, I said honestly. He smiled slightly. Most people don't. Especially the ones who are used to being overlooked. I walked out into the parking lot feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not hope exactly. Awareness. All my life, I'd been told what I cost. Rarely what I qualified for. And for the first time, I wondered how many doors had been quietly open, while my family kept me busy standing guard at theirs. The shift didn't happen loudly. It crept in. After the slap, after the appointment, after I stopped automatically saying yes, the requests didn't decrease, they multiplied. Evan needed rides again. Money again. Favors that somehow became urgent emergencies the moment I hesitated. My mother Linda framed them as small things. Why are you making this difficult? She asked, her voice already sharp with accusation. He's your brother. When I said I couldn't, she sighed like I was exhausting her on purpose. You're overreacting, she said. No one hit you that hard. You're always so dramatic. She spoke as if rewriting the moment could erase it. As if pain only counted if she approved it. Evan leaned into it. He smiled when she spoke for him. He started reminding me of everything they'd ever done for me. Meals, a roof, rides when I was younger, tallying basic care like debt. Every refusal from me was framed as betrayal. Every boundary became proof that I was selfish, unstable, ungrateful. I stayed calm. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever had. The pressure escalated quietly. My mother Linda started forgetting things I'd already paid for, then insisting I still owed money. Evan mentioned bills in my name that I didn't recognize. Small comments at first. Casual. You already agreed to that, he said once, when I hadn't. Mom said you were handling it. Something in me stopped absorbing the blame and started listening for patterns. Late one night, after another circular argument that ended with my mother Linda telling me to just fix it like you always do, I logged into my bank account to reassure myself. The numbers were mostly what I expected, except for one withdrawal I didn't recognize. Then another. Small amounts, spaced just far enough apart to avoid notice. My chest tightened. I checked dates. Vendors. Notes attached to the transactions. They weren't random. One charge was linked to a service Evan used. Another matched a payment my mother Linda had insisted I'd promised to cover. My name. My account. Decisions I hadn't made. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I pulled statements. Took screenshots. Cross-checked dates against messages where I'd said no. Against conversations where they told me I was imagining things. Overreacting. Forgetful. The truth sat there quietly, undeniable in black and white. For the first time, I understood why they needed my compliance so badly. It wasn't just convenience. It was access. And once I saw that, something fundamental shifted. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my memory. I stopped trying to be believed. I started documenting instead. I sat across from Ms. Jennings with my hands folded so tightly they ached. The room was quiet, not awkward, not tense. Just neutral. No one was defending anyone. No one was telling me I was overthinking. Start wherever you need to, she said. So I did. I told her about the bills I never approved. The accounts opened in my name without my knowledge. The notices I never saw because they were intercepted before I could read them. And every time I asked a question, I was told I was being dramatic, paranoid, ungrateful. Ms. Jennings didn't interrupt. She listened. Took notes. Let the silence exist. When I finished, she looked up at me and said something that shifted everything. Rachel, this isn't a misunderstanding. My stomach dropped. What you're describing is identity misuse and financial interference, she continued. Whether it was intentional or out of convenience, the outcome is the same. I whispered, but they're family. She nodded once. Institutions don't factor that in. She turned her screen so I could see. This affects your credit score, your ability to rent or buy property, certain job background checks, professional licenses in some fields, even insurance rates. I felt cold all over. I didn't sign for any of this, I said. I know, she replied gently, and that's exactly why it matters. She explained something no one had ever told me before. Records don't care about emotions. Silence can slowly become assumed consent. The longer damage sits unchallenged, the harder it is to undo. This harm is measurable, she said, and it can be corrected, but only if it's addressed. I stared at the documents in front of me. Copies, dates, patterns I'd quietly saved without knowing why. For years, I'd been told I was sensitive, difficult, unreasonable. None of that existed in this room. Only facts. You have two options, Ms. Jennings said. You can stay silent and absorb the consequences as they surface. Or you can act, calmly, formally, with evidence. I asked the question I was afraid of. If I act, what happens? That depends on how far you go, she said. But the record will finally reflect the truth. I looked down at my folder. I understood something then. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't confrontation. It was about whether I would keep carrying damage that wasn't mine. Ms. Jennings slid one last paper toward me. You don't have to decide today, she said. But understand, doing nothing is still a decision. I closed the folder slowly, and for the first time, silence didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't announce it. There was no speech, no confrontation, no last attempt to be understood. I packed my things slowly over 3 nights. Only what was mine. Clothes folded tight. Documents clipped together. The folder Ms. Jennings had told me to keep stayed with me at all times, like something fragile that finally mattered. On the morning I left, my mother Linda was already busy, complaining into the phone, listing errands that weren't hers to do. Evan's door was closed. He slept late when the world worked for him. My father Thomas sat at the table, staring past his coffee like he always did. No one noticed the empty drawers. No one noticed the silence where I usually moved around them, fixing, anticipating, adjusting. I locked the door behind me without ceremony. The apartment I moved into was small. Too quiet at first. The refrigerator hummed louder than I was used to. I kept expecting someone to call my name sharply from the other room. It took days for my shoulders to drop. I didn't call home. They didn't call me. At first, nothing seemed different, for them. Bills still got paid. Food still appeared. Appointments still existed on the calendar. Evan still left messes and promises unfinished. But systems don't collapse immediately when a support beam is removed. They bend first. A week passed. Then 2. Mail piled up unopened. Deadlines slipped. A payment bounced because no one remembered which account it came from. Evan missed something important. He blamed everyone but himself. My mother Linda complained that things felt off, though she couldn't say why. My father Thomas grew quieter, which I didn't think was possible. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. I watched it buzz on the table. I didn't answer. Later, a message came. Not an apology. Not concern. Just confusion. Did you move some paperwork? Do you know where the login info is? Things aren't lining up. I listened to the voicemail once. Evan's voice, irritated, rushed. Used to me fixing what he broke. For the first time, I didn't. Something small broke that week. Nothing dramatic. Just a process that failed because I wasn't there to quietly correct it. And I understood something clearly then. They didn't miss me yet. They missed the function I served. I set my phone face down and went back to unpacking. The silence in my apartment felt different now. It felt earned. By the second week of my absence, the cracks began to show. Evan tried to follow routines he'd never learned himself. Bills went unpaid. Appointments missed. Vendors called, asking questions he couldn't answer. He barked at the housekeeper to figure it out, only to be met with polite, unyielding confusion. The entitlement he relied on was evaporating. My mother Linda, who had always thrived on control, began to panic. She hovered over the kitchen counter, phone pressed to her ear, repeating the same questions to anyone who would answer. Why isn't this done? Did Rachel take the forms? Where are the receipts? Her voice wavered at times, betraying the calm facade she insisted on in front of Evan. Thomas, my father, the passive enabler, finally looked like he had too much to manage. He shuffled papers nervously at the dining table, muttering to himself, scanning spreadsheets he barely understood. His usual silence became a sign of strain, not authority. Evan's frustration grew daily. Every task he attempted collapsed into confusion. The people he had always relied on, me, were gone. He tried delegating to my mother, but she couldn't be everywhere at once. She snapped at him once in private, accusing him of incompetence with a tone that made him freeze. For the first time, his face betrayed genuine panic. He called my father, demanding guidance. Thomas offered nothing but a cold shrug. He wasn't stepping in. He couldn't. The foundation Evan had relied on for years, my quiet competence, was absent, and suddenly, the small cracks in the house of privilege became glaring gaps. One afternoon, a package arrived for the house. A notice from a bank, an overdue invoice that required signatures. Evan stared at it, utterly lost. My mother scolded him in the hallway while Thomas whispered excuses that satisfied no one. The disarray was no longer just inconvenient. It was visible, undeniable. By now, neighbors noticed the changes too. Deliveries were missed. Doors left unlocked. Errands forgotten. For the first time, the household's reputation was at risk without me there to silently hold it together. Evan shouted once at my mother, frustration breaking through his usual smugness. She recoiled. He flinched at the sound of his own voice, realizing she wasn't going to save him. And then it happened. Something that couldn't be blamed on me. The insurance claim, an essential one for the house, was overdue. Payment never submitted. Service cut off. Linda could not spin it. Thomas could not cover it. Evan's panic had a tangible target, and this time, it wasn't invisible. For the first time, the consequences of my absence had a face. It was no longer whispers or missed expectations. It was a problem that would hit them all in the open. And there was no one left to silently fix it. The first message came quietly, almost hesitant. Evan's name flashed on my phone, a text that read, "Rachel, we need to talk. I can fix this." I didn't reply. Not immediately. I let it sit, letting the vibration echo like a metronome through my quiet apartment. Minutes later, another, "Please. I'm serious. Call me." The calm I carried for months didn't crack, though my fingers hovered over the screen longer than I expected. This was the same brother who had mocked me, who had thrived on my silent compliance. Now, the tone had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, desperation hiding beneath the veneer of entitlement. I reminded myself of every small detail he had assumed he could manipulate. Every invoice he tried to forge, every form he had submitted in my name, every late payment he blamed on clerical errors. I had tracked them all. Documented. Stored. Organized. My calm wasn't absence, it was evidence. Another message arrived. "You don't understand." I didn't mean. He stopped mid-text. I imagined him staring at the screen, realizing my silence wasn't ignorance. My patience wasn't weakness. For once, the air between us carried weight he hadn't calculated. I finally typed one line, not soft, not threatening, simply stating facts he could not ignore. "I'm aware of everything you've done in my name." No exclamation, no accusation, just precision. The effect was immediate. His next messages tumbled over themselves, spelling panic in fragmented sentences. I didn't think you'd notice. Can we fix this? Please, don't." He tried to negotiate, to bargain, to remind me of years when his failures had slipped past unchallenged. I read, observed, let him unravel in silence. There was no indulgence, no lecture, no threat. Only awareness. Each word he typed revealed the depth of his miscalculation. He had assumed my restraint meant ignorance, and that assumption had been his shield for too long. I didn't respond again. Not yet. Not until the consequences had begun their inevitable march. His panic was audible even through the text, a tremor I had never heard in person. And now, it wasn't just words. I could see the threads of authority, legal and financial, beginning to bind him where he had thought none existed. The power had shifted quietly, irrevocably, and I remained the calm observer, letting the weight of his own actions press down. Soon, the official consequences, formal notices, phone calls from institutions, auditors, would reach him directly. I didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't bargain. He was beginning to understand that my silence had teeth. The following weeks passed like a slow tide, relentless but quiet. I watched from a distance as the repercussions of Evan's choices unfolded, each consequence precise and factual, leaving no room for excuses. Notices arrived, letters, phone calls, auditors' inquiries. Every institution he had assumed would shield him now cut cleanly through the layers of entitlement he had built around himself. My mother, who had once struck me for saying no, now hovered nervously over Evan, her voice tight and clipped when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The same woman who had made me small in her eyes and everyone else's was now scrambling to preserve appearances, fumbling explanations that couldn't erase the documentation she had ignored for years. Thomas, ever the passive enabler, sat silently beside her, the weight of his inaction pressing visibly against him. He had watched, said nothing, and now he too faced the unspoken judgment of the truth laying bare what had been ignored for too long. Evan called repeatedly at first, each message tinged with panic and the unmistakable realization that I had been far more aware than he'd imagined. But I didn't answer. Not for days. Not for weeks. My calm became a mirror, reflecting back everything he had assumed he could manipulate or hide. The world around him no longer conformed to his desires. Even the extended family began to shift subtly. Whispers, hesitant greetings, avoidance instead of dominance. They felt the ripple of events, the fact that the narrative he had relied upon was no longer credible. And yet, I stayed removed, a quiet presence they could not reach, a truth they could not twist. My silence was not absence, it was authority in its purest, most invisible form. I attended to my own life, my responsibilities, the small victories of rebuilding without spectacle. There were moments of reflection, fleeting but sharp, when I realized how often mockery hides dependency, how often a family's judgmental words conceal the truth that the person they dismiss is the one holding the real power. It wasn't satisfaction that I felt, nor joy in watching their discomfort, it was clarity. Every act, every call, every misstep of Evan's revealed itself without my interference. The chaos unfolded naturally, almost mechanically, because systems respond to facts, not to noise. By the time official consequences reached him, legal restrictions, financial scrutiny, formal documentation of his misuses, he had nowhere to deflect blame. No one to persuade, no argument left unexamined. He had gambled on my compliance, my silence, my weakness. And now, the system he had underestimated corrected itself without fanfare. I remained calm, observing, documenting quietly but not reacting. The emotional storms my mother tried to conjure, the frantic explanations Evan flung into the void, they no longer touched me. I realized fully that power is often measured in restraint, in the ability to step back and let truth operate on its own timeline. In the stillness of one late evening, sitting with the faint hum of the city outside my window, I made a decision, not for them, not for vengeance, not for approval, but for myself. I would no longer allow my life to be dictated by their expectations, their whims, or their entitlement. And in that quiet certainty, I found an almost imperceptible liberation. I didn't feel angry. The months that followed were defined by routine and quiet control. I rented a small apartment a few blocks from my office, a space that belonged only to me, free from the judgments, demands, and volatility I had carried for years. Every piece of furniture, every book, every plant, was a reminder that my life was finally unshared, unclaimed, and mine. The mornings were still, the city outside humming without expectation, and I moved through each day with the same precision I had always demanded of myself, but now, without interference. Occasionally, I would hear echoes from home. Messages on the voicemail, texts that hesitated between apology and excuse, attempts to draw me back into a world I had already exited. Evan's voice was lower, less certain than before, but the underlying assumption persisted, that I could still be swayed, that my boundaries were negotiable. My mother's calls came sporadically, tentative, her sharpness softened but still present, as if testing whether the old control could be restored. Thomas remained mostly silent, but the weight of his inaction hung over every conversation, a passive reminder of where responsibility had been abandoned. I never returned their calls. I never justified, never explained, never begged them to understand. There was no spectacle in my refusal, no dramatic declaration, no need to prove a point. Silence became its own authority. Their disappointment, frustration, and occasional panic played out without me, as naturally as gravity itself. They were learning the truth too late, the consequences of underestimating a sister who had chosen herself over their favoritism, her worth over their manipulation. In this space, I began noticing small, quiet victories. I handled my finances without interference, organized my schedule without guilt, and allowed myself pleasures that had always been denied under their scrutiny. A quiet lunch with a friend, a weekend hike without explanation, a spontaneous class at a local studio. Each decision reinforced a life lived on my terms. It was not rebellion, it was ownership. I realized that the power they had always assumed they held, the authority to dictate my movements, my choices, my self-worth, was imaginary. Even when they tried to reach me, I stayed calm. I let the messages linger, unanswered. I let the rare attempts at face-to-face reconciliation pass me by. There was no malice in my choice, only recognition. Their remorse was convenient, their apologies incomplete, their attempts to rewrite history shallow. I had no need to engage in their narratives. My life had moved beyond them. And in the stillness of my decision, I understood a truth I had never fully allowed myself to see while growing up. That self-respect is not given, it is claimed, and it is preserved in the quiet refusal to yield. I did not need them to acknowledge it. I did not need their approval. I only needed to honor the boundary I had drawn years before, in a moment that once left me bruised but awake to my own strength. Some people don't hate your success, they hate losing control over you.